Welcome to part 2 of my 3-part series on photographing jewelry. In the previous video, I went over various aspects of our cameras and began talking about settings and lighting. In this video, I start getting into the details of taking the actual photos of our jewelry. Some of the things we'll cover include where to shoot, diffused lighting, lighting types, the light tent, backgrounds, types of shots, the layout, props and models, and invisible help. So let's begin with where to shoot. Deciding where to take your photographs is a rather important task. I know a lot of people who achieve marvelous photos when shooting by only sunlight or daylight. I haven't taken a jewelry photo outside in about 12 years, so all I have to show you for outside images is some mushrooms in our orchard. Other people swear by a controlled environment, such as a light tent, that they can rely on day after day, day or night. My suggestion is to try as many scenarios as possible and decide for yourself which works with your style, your time constraints, and with your photographic skill or your camera's ability. Wherever you end up shooting your work, strive for consistency. If you almost always use the same background, the same shooting environment, and the same lighting, you won't have to adjust your camera settings much from one day to the next, and your online shop will have a more cohesive look to it. I have 2 dedicated spaces in my studio where I have light tents set up that never move. In one light tent, the lighting is on the inside. That's the image on the right, which is a Folio 2, by the way. And the other light tent is a 20-inch pop-up tent with the lighting on the outside. More details to follow. But now we'll discuss diffused lighting. Whether you're shooting indoors or outdoors, try to make sure your subject isn't in direct light. These earrings may appear to have a direct light on them because you see things clearly and the shadow has a stark edge. These were, however, actually taken with diffused lighting. I'll show you a comparison of direct and indirect lighting, but first let's talk about diffused and direct lighting. Direct light, which for our purposes is the opposite of diffused lighting, just means that there's no obstacle between the light source and your piece of jewelry. Direct light can be from light bulbs, sunlight, and the flash of your camera. When you take photographs with a direct source of light upon your subject, it can create harsh shadows. It can flatten depth of 3D objects. It can create unwanted reflections on metal, and it can dull your colors. So what we want to do is diffuse the light before it reaches the jewelry. All of the light sources that I just mentioned can and should be diffused before reaching the item that you're photographing. Diffused means to spread out. We want to spread the light out so that when it hits our item, the light is not coming from one concentrated location. And just a reminder of something I said in the previous video, the information I present in these tutorials is intended as a starting point for those who seek help with taking close-up photos of their work. People with photography expertise can go against typical recommendations and advice and still come up with great photos. But to break the rules, you must first learn and understand them. My job here is to try to give you a balance of lots of information so that you can try things out, as well as I want to show you personal examples of the things that work for me. Here are 2 photos of the same bracelet taken at the same time, one in direct sunlight and the other also outdoors and within a minute of the other shot, but taken in the shade. The stark shadows of the photo on the left can be a distraction and can make a photo look amateurish. One way to diffuse the light source is by using a light tent. I've used the 2 shown on the top row here. I've never used the cloud dome per se, like the one on the bottom left, but I have used a cloud dome, by which I mean I removed the cover of one of my living room floor lamps and made a sort of do-it-yourself dome for a bit. I've seen people make similar dome things out of the cone of shame, which is the plastic cat and dog collar that keeps them from licking themselves when they get back from the vet. The image on the bottom right isn't a light tent, but serves the same purpose. Here, the diffusing material is actually attached to the light bulb apparatus rather than to something that houses your jewelry. It's just another system for diffusing the light. If you don't have a light tent and you want to try out some diffused lighting, you can rig a piece of vellum between your light source and your object. I've made more than one do-it-yourself light tent over the years. Aside from the frosted glass dome I mentioned earlier, here's one I made after stripping the outer fabric off of a lampshade that I bought at a thrift store. This was when I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with 2 other people and several animals. You have to find ways to make do. One downside to this setup was that I could only shoot straight down onto the jewelry. As the years wore on, every do-it-yourself light tent I made was getting closer and closer to what I actually wanted. Here's another do-it-yourself setup I made by cutting holes in the sides of a large cardboard box and taping vellum paper to the sides and top, and cooking foil to the back. There's a wide variety of light tents on the market, as you can see if you Google photography light tent, and there are a lot of do-it-yourself photo tent options easily accessible on the internet too. Doing a Google or Bing search will net you many choices. So here are my current 2 setups. The first one, this is for the money shots, which is the impact photos that are the first ones a customer sees. It's a 20-inch pop-up tent with dark glass over black paper on the bottom. To achieve the angle I want, I'm using this little tripod that allows the camera to angle almost straight down onto the piece. I have a piece of white paper that curves in the light box. The white paper is draped from the front top of the box to the bottom back of the box. My glass that I mentioned is holding down the edge of the paper in the back. In front, I have clips to hold the top edge of the paper. There are links in the handout to the exact items I've purchased. I'll describe my lighting in the next section. Oh, by the way, that brown colored thing that my tripod is on top of, that's a large piece of paper that I keep on top of my glass when I'm not photographing. Helps keep the dust at bay. And this is the light tent for the shots of jewelry that shots of the jewelry in my hand, shots of the jewelry hanging if necessary, shots of the jewelry on a model or a bust. This is a Foldio 2, which has 2 LED strips of dimmable lights that shine directly into the cube from a flap that's at the top front. You can see remnants of my packing tape as I attempted to bend the fold down into a position that I preferred. There's no other lighting in this light box, so this one actually does use direct lighting rather than diffused lighting, except when I cheat, and I'll explain that in a minute. Because of the direct lighting in this light tent, I will get things that look like this. See the line, the gray line at the bottom of the pendant, that's created from the direct light making a shadow on the frame that's holding my pendant. But I've been using this cube for several years, and I just learned to work around things that I don't like. So I mentioned the shadows in the background. Again, they're created when I use a frame to hold my jewelry. We'll talk more about frames in a bit. Because of the direct lighting, my pendant, the frame holding the pendant, is creating the shadow on the back. To get around this, sometimes I'll take a piece of white foam board. Oh, this stuff is amazing. I recommend keeping some on hand. We'll talk about that later too. Anyway, I'll take a piece of foam board or cardboard and actually hold it near the light, between the light and the image, so that the lighting would then be indirect or diffused. Because of less light, I might have to open the camera's aperture some more, which means a smaller f-stop, or I could increase the shutter time. I plan to shoot some video to include in this workshop showing showing you exactly how I use the light tint in real time with some of these scenarios. But as you can see here, I cropped close enough to the pendant that I could fix the shadow. Generally, the only other shots I take that don't involve my light tints are taken on my mannequin. Do you need 2 light tints? Absolutely not. One of the main reasons I use 2 is because my money shot setup is so particular, with the tripod being taped down to the table and that thick curled paper being just at the right angle, that I don't want to have to change that setup often or even ever. So out of laziness, I decided to spoil myself with 2 permanent, different shooting setups. Okay, now lighting. Different types of lights can give photos different color casts. Like shooting with your camera's flash may give your photo a blue tinge, while shooting something in sunlight may give your photo a yellow tinge. And this can happen even if you adjusted your white balance, which we talked about in the first lesson. If you still end up with a color cast in your photos, we'll try to fix it in part 3, which is the photo editing portion of this workshop. What you want to avoid is having different types of lights, and here are some of the types of lights. One of the most important rules of lighting is don't mix your lighting. So you don't want sunshine and fluorescent at the same time on your subject, and you don't want an incandescent light bulb on one side and an LED bulb on the other. And within your bulb type, you still have to make sure your bulbs are on the same color spectrum. Let me show you what I mean. In the world of lights, there's a thing called the Kelvin scale of color temperature. This Kelvin scale gives a rating to each type of light that's based on the color output of the bulb. So even within your choices of fluorescent or LED bulbs, you have to be sure to select bulbs that are in the same Kelvin rating. Here are some basics of the Kelvin scale. Candlelight, for example, produces a red, also known as warm, cast to your photos. Incandescent bulbs and any bulb rated as soft light will produce a yellowish tone to your photo. Daylight bulbs, or bulbs rated on the Kelvin scale between 5,000 and 6,500, are going to be the most neutral as far as coloring goes. Shaded daylight often produces a blue cast, also known as cool tones. I always use bulbs in the 5,000 to 6,500 range. My preference is LED, non-dimmable. See the handout for the actual brand I use if you like. So color, when we're talking about light bulbs, is the Kelvin rating, also known as the temperature of the light, also known as daylight versus soft light. Remember back in the first class, the class where we were talking about the camera, we were talking about setting your white balance for the type of lighting you were shooting under. In these 3 shots, I've kept the white balance in one place, but changed my lighting. You can see how different light sources affect the color cast of the photos. Nothing changed in these photos other than what I was using as a light source. Daylight bulbs on the left, which is a bulb with a Kelvin rating of between like 5,000 and 6,000. The one in the middle is using a regular old incandescent bulb, which is a lower Kelvin rating. And the one on the right is shooting outside in the shade with no additional lighting, which is a high Kelvin rating. And even when we do our best to have completely natural colors in our photos, sometimes a color cast sneaks in. I can't tell you how many times I've seen someone end up with a blue or red or yellow cast to their photo and they think they just have to live with it. Absolutely not. You will see in our third workshop section how to bring the photo back to correct colors quickly and easily. And while we can do a lot in photo editing, the goal is to not have to do a lot in photo editing. That's why I'm talking to you about lights and their color and being consistent and avoiding reflection, etc., etc. Trust me, you'll be overjoyed to have to do nothing other than crop when you get to photo editing. So the better we can make the photo while taking the shot, the less time we waste overall. Learning to read a light bulb package is a handy skill. Let's take one for example. The things I look for are type, brightness, color, dimmability, and the true wattage usage. When reading a light bulb package, there are lots of things to look for. Personally, I head straight to the LED bulb section. Luckily, it's not hard to find that these days. After that, I look for brightness. My photo setup includes two 100 watt equivalent bulbs and one 60 watt equivalent bulb. Watts are becoming a thing of the past as we transition into different types of bulbs, so eventually we may just be looking at the lumens, which is the brightness, and the energy used. But for now, packages are still pretty much saying their wattage equivalents, since it's what most of us grew up with and what we're familiar with. You should see a rating called lumens. This is a measurement of the brightness or how much light you're actually getting from the bulb. What we think of as a 100-watt light bulb would be like a 1500 or 1600 lumens. A 60-watt bulb is 800 lumens, and a 40-watt bulb is 450 lumens. Next, I look for color. Oh, here we go, color. I make sure it says daylight on the packaging. See right here, daylight. And I make sure that I don't see the word soft on the packaging anywhere. Remember, soft light means a lower Kelvin rating. A daylight bulb should be in the 5000 to 6500 range on the Kelvin scale, which would be a neutral color cast, or the most natural colors. See, this one is showing you it's 5000 on the color scale. A soft bulb will be lower on the Kelvin scale and will give your images a warm or reddish yellow cast. Some packages have this Kelvin scale rating on the side or the back of the box, so make sure you check everywhere on the light bulb box. Whatever color or Kelvin rating you go with, make sure that all your bulbs are the same rating. Since I don't use dimmable sockets, I buy non-dimmable bulbs. And here is the true watt usage. Energy used 16 watts. So even though it says brightness is a wattage equivalent of 100, what we want to look for is also the true watt usage, and I'll show you why. True wattage is the number that's important to me because sockets are rated for different allowances of wattage. In other words, I wouldn't want to put a 100-watt light bulb in a socket that's rated for no more than 40 watts. But when we're talking about bulbs that don't advertise watts the way they used to, like old incandescent bulbs, we have to look for the energy used instead. These here are the labels that are inside. They're on the inside of my 3 different lamps. And those are all the lamps that I'm using for the light tent number 1. 2 of these are clamp-on reflector collars, and the third is a clamp-on desk light. I have to make sure that the energy used number on the light bulb is lower than the maximum wattage rating of the socket. To give you a specific example, in my 2 side lights, which are the 2 labels on the top here, I was able to use my 100-watt equivalent bulbs because the energy used is actually only 16 watts. So you can see here the ratings. But the desk lamp that I use, this one that I use as my bounce light, this label at the bottom here, it's only rated for 13 watts, see, 13 watt. So I don't want to put one of my brighter bulbs in it. Instead, for that lamp, I purchased a 60 watt equivalent, which is 800 lumens and only has 8 watts of energy used. So that's it for buying the right bulbs. These bulbs do cost a little bit more than cheap old bulbs, but they're really wonderful. I've actually replaced all the bulbs in my house with daylight LED bulbs. And if any of this is still confusing to you, definitely ask me. You can purchase special tripods and stands for your lighting, or you can make adjustments that fit your budget and your work area. Here I show some reflective collars. These are reflective collars. They serve the additional purpose of increasing the amount of light. On the right, you can see some photography light bulb stands. I don't have anything that looks like that. Here's my setup again. I have two reflective collars clamped to scrap pieces of wood on either side of my tent, here and here. I have my bounce light clamped to the front of my table. This is just a plain old desk light that's clamped down here. This, by the way, is an old computer desk. Again, you can see the handout for the links to the exact items that I use. Another thing I do is that I plug all these lights into one power strip, which serves two purposes. One is that the reflective collars that I use, they don't have on-off switches, so then I can just use the power strip as the on-off switch. The other reason is that I don't like to leave these lights on when I'm not there. They don't actually get hot, but I do have them really, really close to the fabric of the pop-up tent, so just to be cautious. I'm definitely an overly cautious person. Anyway, so all I have to do is flip the power strip on and all my lights are on, and when I flip the power switch off, all my lights go off. So it's actually a time saver too. So once you've figured out where you want to shoot, you've still got to select your background. Now we get more into the territory of personal preference, so please take my opinions as only that, opinions. If you're the type of person who prefers props in the background to create a specific atmosphere, just make sure your jewelry stands out as the focal point. For the record, I did not shoot this ring 6 different times on different colored backgrounds. I changed the background color in Photoshop, and that's something I can show you how to do if you're interested. For my design aesthetic, I prefer backgrounds that are neutral colors with no texture and no props. But I've seen a lot of very stylish photos that were the complete opposite of that advice. I've also seen a lot of boring photos that followed that advice. So it's all up to, it's about what end result you want, what you prefer, the aesthetics of your jewelry line, and what you think your customers will be attracted to. Several years ago, I created some gradient backgrounds in Photoshop, and I'd print them out onto photo paper using high quality printing from my LaserJet printer, or excuse me, my inkjet printer. If that's something you want to try, there's a link in the handouts to these backgrounds that I created. But there's some downsides to that. You can purchase special photography gradient papers from camera shops, but I've had a hard time finding small ones. So if something is like a gradient background and it's 3 feet tall, I mean, I'm only shooting on like 5 inches of it, so it doesn't actually end up looking gradient at all. Recently, I custom ordered a 15 by 15 vinyl gradient backdrop from somebody on Etsy. When it gets here, I'll test it out. If I like it, I'll definitely share her information with you so you can order them too. Vinyl I like better than paper or photographic paper because those scratch so easily. I've also heard from some people that will use office stores like Office Max, Staples, Kinko's, that they say you can print them on vinyl there too, or on paper that they laminate. I have no experience with that, but it's something to explore. Maybe neutral isn't your thing. Large craft, art, or hobby stores usually also have a vast supply of various papers. I mean, like an entire aisle of different papers that might work out as backgrounds. I know Michael's, they have at least 2 rows of papers with images and designs as well as various colors and textures. I rarely shoot on an all-white background. It's just a personal preference. If you do want to shoot on a stark white background, my advice is to be careful about the entire shot looking blown out. That's when the whole thing is too bright. And I don't always use paper as a background. I have a small array of tiles from Home Depot. I've used glossy black bathroom tiles, matte black wall tiles, slate kitchen floor tiles. All 3 of these shots, as a matter of fact, were shot on a pitch black glossy bathroom tile. Notice that the background no longer looks black. I think that's a really nice effect. Personally, I often like a little reflection of my pieces, but I don't like too much reflection. The ring on the right, To me, that's too much reflection. In my first years of selling jewelry online, I even experimented with shooting jewelry on a mirror. Oh man, that was not good. You could barely tell where the jewelry ended and the reflection began. A 2-strand bracelet suddenly looked like a 4-strand bracelet. But experimenting is how we learn these things. For my light tent number 1, the tent where I shoot pretty much straight down and onto the jewelry piece, I have a piece of smoked glass with a sheet of matte black paper underneath it. By the way, my workplace is not pristine. It's practical. So you may notice objects around my light tents or in the backgrounds. I decided not to clear the area for the sake of these videos because I want you to know that you don't have to have a 10-foot by 10-foot empty room in order to take good photos. Every workstation in my studio is a different surface, from dining room tables to baker's racks, computer desks, and wine racks. Use what you can where you can. Also, notice the tape right here on the back leg of my tripod. This was to ensure my tripod didn't slip off the desk and kill the camera. But of course, having that tape there also means I pretty much want to leave my setup and not have to disassemble it every time. For my light tent number 2, I have a variety of backgrounds, probably more than I need because I really only use 2 or 3 go-to backgrounds, since I prefer to keep a sort of cohesive look to my photos. You'll notice that outside of the tent looks kind of dark, around there. That's because I generally turn off all the other lights in the studio when I photograph. This reduces the risk of mixing lighting types. When I shoot in light tent number 2, I often use a frame to hold the piece of jewelry like this in front of the background. So in this photo, my pendant is hanging from an acrylic frame. Again, the buying info for that is in the handout. This is the same frame I use when I want a shot of hanging earrings. Notice the piece of white foam board, this thing here, at an angle in front of the pendant. And this, by the way, is just a ring display that I'm using to hold up the foam. Because the light source of my folio, which is up here, is so awkward, I use this piece of foam board to bounce the light onto the front of the piece from below. I'll actually get into this a little bit more later, but it's being held up at an angle, like I said, from the ring stand. After taking this photo, I had to edit out the strings that hold the pendant. I also had to edit out the scratches from this. This is a piece of gradient, but it's on paper, so it scratches really easily. But see, you can still see these horizontal lines that were the shadows cast from the frame. This is a pendant that I kept for myself, so I didn't go to too much trouble in the photo editing. But these are some of the reasons that I switched my main shots to light tent number 1, which is the money shots, and I keep this one, the folio, which is light tent number 2, for other purposes. You can shoot on a flat background, the bottom, or in front of a vertical background, like here. I suppose in theory you could also shoot on a slanted or curved background, but I prefer the easiest ways of shooting jewelry. So I'm going to end right now, and this lesson on photographing your jewelry, this middle part, the setup, is actually continued on part 2 of this video.